Its software can hack the phones of journalists and activists, but the Israeli firm NSO has just won a legal battle to stop selling its products to some governments. So who's responsible when surveillance technology is misused? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. Activists, journalists, even the world's richest man, all are said to have been hacked by spyware developed by the Israeli company called the NSO Group. But the firm insists its products are only sold to authorised government agencies to fight terrorism and crime. Rights group Amnesty International says one of its researchers was also targeted. It sued NSO to revoke its export licence from the Israeli Defence Ministry. After 6 months of hearings behind closed doors, a court in Tel Aviv dismissed the case. The judge concluded the ministry was thorough and meticulous in granting the licence, which means the company is now free to continue selling its products abroad.
Amnesty, or the petitioners who belong to the management of Amnesty Israel, did not provide any evidence even regarding the identity of such a person, that his phone was intercepted. So we don't know even that it really happened.
Amnesty International is disappointed, yes, but not surprised by the court's ruling. It's been a long-standing tradition for the Israeli courts to be a rubber stamp for the Israeli Ministry of Defense, their impunity for Israeli companies that are accomplices for violation of human rights and murderous regimes. We are hopeful that we will be able to convince people to join our call for an amendment in the Israeli law that will allow us to prevent such situations in the future.
NSO faces a number of allegations that its technology is being used to spy on civilians. Facebook is suing the firm, accusing it of hacking the accounts of more than 1,400 WhatsApp users. The smartphones of journalists, dissidents, human rights activists are amongst them. Citizens Lab, a research firm at the University of Toronto, has linked NSO's Pegasus spyware to political surveillance in 6 countries, including Mexico and the UAE. A Saudi activist accuses NSO of providing the kingdom with software to monitor his phone conversations with the late journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And a UN report suggests that NSO's spyware may have been used by the Saudi Crown Prince to hack the phone of Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos. Let's bring in our guests in Enschede in the Netherlands, Nolen Gertz, Assistant Professor at the University of Twente, in West Jerusalem, Amichai Stein, a political writer, and in London, Nishanth Sastry, a Professor of Computer Science at the University of Surrey. A welcome to you all. Now, we did reach out to NSO and Amnesty International, but they weren't able to join the programme. But I do want to begin our discussion in West Jerusalem with Amichai Stein. You have, on the one hand, NSO saying, well, actually, Amnesty International didn't give us enough evidence, and so the court made the right decision. Then you have Amnesty International saying quite clearly that actually the Israeli High Court is simply a rubber stamp for the Ministry of Defense, and they were always going to make that decision. Now, it must be interesting for you as a journalist in West Jerusalem covering all of this, because it is journalists that have been allegedly targeted by an Israeli spyware firm. So, you know, that must be of concern to you, right?
The story, the division you said, it's very interesting because each company, as you said, who exports outside Israel security issues needs to get the permission of the defense ministry. So this is a big question. Exactly, does the defense ministry exactly know what is going on with NSO, or is NSO telling the whole story to the defense department? Now, right now, here in Israel, I need to tell you, we didn't find any, let's say, cases of NSO using it here. So the big question is, what's going on outside? So what we each day, and even tonight, that we're hearing that NSO software was allegedly found in the cell phone of the head of the Catalan, a senior Catalan politician, and he claims Spain government put it inside. So the company NSO says, listen, we are not doing anything bad. When you ask him as a journalist, we are selling software to fight crime, to fight the bad guys. But what we're learning each day, really stories about claims that NSO software was used against opposition figures. So really, this is the big, as a journalist, when you ask them, they say, listen, this is the regular comment, we're not selling to the bad guys, but each day you have these stories. So it's a very difficult situation right now. And the court decision, the court said, we do not have proof that NSO is allowing the software to the people who use it to spy against people. So this is a very difficult story really to cover. As a journalist, it is a problem for me to hear that other colleagues are maybe being spied on. And I have covered it not once, talked with journalists that allegedly the software was found on their phone. But as a whole, this is a very difficult story to cover because you have really two sides of the story. And at least at this point, they don't clash. There's not evidence that's showing them clash together.
Let's bring in Nishanth and Sastry in London here. Nishanth, we make the software, says NSO. We sell the software, says NSO. We give it to the governments. What they do after that, not up to us. It's up to the governments. But it's not as simple as that, is it? Because there is after-sales service, to use a consumer term. There is people who, from NSO, will be helping those governments to use that software. It's not as simple as we give it to the governments and then what they do is up to them, surely.
Well, there's what you said, but there's also the issue of what should really be the responsibility of technology firms when the technology they're developing could potentially be used for nefarious purposes. And at some point, I think, the technology firms need to own up to their full responsibility and then decide, okay, here's where we are crossing a certain line of ethics, and maybe we shouldn't be selling to certain governments or to certain institutions which might then go and misuse the powerful software which they're developing. So there's that argument to be made as well. But on the other hand, once a consumer of the software has bought the software, whether it's Apple's iOS on their iPhones could be bought by a terrorist, which they can then use to collaborate with or communicate with other terrorists. So would you hold Apple responsible for the use of their software for potentially killing millions of people or hundreds of people or thousands of people, whatever the case may be? So there is a gray line here. I'm just not exactly sure where the line is because many details haven't actually been made clear to us.
Well, Nolen Gertz, it is an interesting argument, isn't it? It's not software that spies on people, it's people that spy on people. Is that right?
Well, it's unfortunately not so easy to divide the two in the same way that you could imagine talking about someone with a gun as opposed to without a gun. And the idea is that the gun itself plays a role in shaping the situation. We could say the same here about surveillance tools. They are not simply instruments to be used by good people or bad people. Simply possessing the tool itself is going to help shape how we think of the situation. In the same way that we say, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Someone with a surveillance tool, everything looks like someone who should be spied on for the interest of the state or for the interest of the private owner. And this is the kind of thing, as the previous commentator stated, has to be held in responsibility with the developer of the device. It's not enough to say we did everything ethical on our part, then we sold it, and it's up to the ethics of the user. It has to be built in. It has to be ethics by design.
Amichai, Stein in West Jerusalem. I've been to Israel on many occasions, on many reporting trips. Most of the time, when I wind up at the government press office, I have a conversation that involves Israel's tech sector. Why do you, international journalists, not cover Israel's tech sector more than we do? And that's often the conversation that we have. Israel is quite rightly proud of its tech sector. Is this a case, then, that the Israeli High Court has simply gone, this is too big for us to touch? There may have been wrongdoing here, but the tech sector is too important for Israel.
I don't think it's an issue that the court said it's too big to touch, because like you said before, there's a question about an equipment and about the people. There is not yet probably an evidence to show that NSO explicitly, gave guidance how to spy on political figures or how to spy against a human rights activist. So we have records of them selling the equipment, but we don't have a record of them really helping in tracking these guys or journalists or people. So this is at this point, I think that the court said we cannot say anything about it, because even the defense ministry, hasn't got any opinion or hasn't got any evidence that can show us and tell us that something there is going wrong. And right now, NSO in Israel is continuing to work as normally. There isn't any really limitation in its activity in Israel. But I need to say, NSO is not the only Israeli company, when you talk about the tech industry, that sells equipment that sometimes you have, a lot of questions about. Sometimes many companies that question arise about the legitimacy of how fair is the equipment that these companies are being sold, that it's being used, and former military personnel that suddenly go into third countries and help train militants or militaries, sometimes not fighting the real decent wars. So there's a lot of moral issues about sometimes about the Israeli tech companies, the former military guys who go abroad. But the court, I think, the problem is he didn't have the gold evidence that could have made him decide, listen, we have here a red light, we need to order it sometimes to halt to its activity or some kind of stop to its export of equipment outside of Israel.
But Amichai, let's be absolutely clear about this. When you're selling sensitive software such as this, the NSO needs, if not an clear export license, but it certainly needs an agreement from the Ministry of Defense and from the government. This is just diplomacy that all countries use when they're selling, whether it's arms or sensitive information to a third country. There has to be an approval. So there would have been an approval from the government of Israel to the government of Saudi Arabia for them to purchase this piece of equipment. There's a lot of outreach, as we know, between the Israeli government and the Saudis. The Israeli government is trying to reach out to the Sunni states in particular to try and bring them in. So there is some collusion here. We can say that quite definitively.
What you talked about, the export of Israel to the Gulf countries, to Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf countries, is something here really that isn't allowed to be talked publicly. You usually read it on, according to foreign sources in international media. The Israeli media is really very limited on how much it can report about it. But there are ties, and I think, again, let's say according to foreign sources, if there's deals like this between Israeli companies and the Gulf countries, I think that, let's say, Israel as a whole has an interest to do these kinds of deals, because it makes stronger the ties between the countries, it makes the industry much more stronger between. And again, the claim when you come to them and ask them, listen, this equipment is being used against human rights activists, again, other people, they say, again, the claim is all over again. We do not sell to these kinds of... First of all, by the way, they say we are not talking about who we sell this equipment to. But the second phase is also, even if you would tell you, we are selling it only to fight terror and crime and other things. So again, the answer is quite clear, but I think on the table, if you would ask Israeli officials if they have interest that such Israeli companies sell equipment to Gulf or Arab countries, yes, they have interest because it does make the ties much more stronger. And it's kind of a shadow industry. It's not on the table.
Nishanth Sastry in London, how much of this is kind of proprietary technology? I mean, if you managed to get hold of one of these phones that had a piece of this software in it, could you definitively say this came from NSO? This came from, is it easily trackable, or are we talking a very murky world here?
So if you got a phone, you would look for signatures of the kinds of software that you have seen before, which had certain capabilities, and it might well be the case that given a particular phone, you could say, here's a piece of software that we know has also been sold to other people, and we've seen with other phones that might perhaps have been captured in the field, which looks very similar, and that those are, if we know definitively that those other phones had NSO software in them, then you could potentially link them together. But equally, there are a hacker or a hacker kit could come in and write something which replicates some of the same functionality as NSO, which might make it a little bit difficult. But software in itself, there are a number of signatures that you can look for. So there's a very good chance that if you had the right kind of security expert looking at it, they might be able to pinpoint it to NSO or any particular organization.
Actually, Nolen Gertz in the Netherlands, Nishanth Sastry makes a very interesting point, doesn't he? The genie is out the box once the software is out there. It's not just the governments that, are able to use that. They actually could be able to clone it. Hackers could be able to use it. How much does that worry you?
Yeah, I think this is the kind of thing we need to be on alert about, and why we need to ask not about how to use these technologies properly, but whether they should be developed in the first place. And you can imagine the response is always going to be, well, if we don't make it, someone else will. So there's always the arms race way of thinking about this. But at the same time, this will come back to bite you at some point. So when you put these things on the market, there's nothing stopping it from being used against you. So again, this creates not just about surveillance technology in a vacuum, but about a whole system of cyber warfare. And that we need to be aware of, again, as I was saying earlier, how this not only shapes how the users think about the technology, but also about how the people, like journalists, like politicians, what is called the chilling effect, right? So the very fact that these things could be used against you, whether or not you have any proof of it, could still be enough to make you paranoid, to make you, not want to report certain things, not want to discuss, for example, this very case. So again, we have to be aware of how these kinds of technologies, how these kinds of systems really change the environment in a way sort of similar to biological or chemical warfare. And there's a reason that was banned precisely because of its effect outside of the battlefield on the entire environment.
Amichai, Stein, that's an interesting point, isn't it? People are afraid that their phones are being monitored if they talk about certain subjects, particularly in more, shall we say, tighter regimes. However, in Israel, you have a free press. In Israel, there is debate. But like you said earlier, people simply aren't talking about this particular subject. Why is that?
This is something, again, you can talk about it quite freely about the story, but I think, and again, the stories right now in Israel, you didn't find some kind of stories regarding this software. I think this is probably some kind of, again, maybe a strategy. It's that you cannot find stories here about NSO. You do talk about stories that come from abroad, but right here in Israel, we didn't find any stories regarding NSO, people being hacked or something like that. Otherwise, I think if you would have found the story and the outcry would have been much more stronger against the Israeli defense industry and maybe other components of that allowing this work right here. So this is a story that is covered here very broadly, and I think maybe people sometimes, maybe afraid maybe their phone might be hacked, but as long I think as it doesn't happen right, it isn't reported that we found something here in Israel. At this point, it continue like this, working without an outcry. So we are reporting, listen, you heard in Mexico, listen, you heard in Spain, you hear in other countries, but until I think we will find maybe such a story in Israel, it will stay as covering some kind of foreign news story and talking about maybe the moral issues of giving a country such a weapon, but things I don't think is going to change maybe until you'll find such a story here in Israel.
I want to ask all three of you the same question. I'll begin with Nishanth the Sastry in London. Is it time now for a charter, a United Nations Charter of digital rights, to stop things like this from being developed? Is it time for an international agreement to control the way these things are, much in the same way we have arms control treaties?
It's a very good question. I was just 2-3 days back reading about a new plane that was being developed, and they were saying this might be the last plane that is being developed in which there will be a human pilot sits and flies that plane for in an army or in a battle situation. So more and more battles are being driven by autonomous vehicles, unmanned aerial vehicles, and things like that. More and more, it's less. It's not about anymore the biological or the chemical issues, that weapons that are the things that we should think about, but rather the enemy comes into very easily invades into the heart of a nation, into our own laptops, into our own smartphones, and is able to get information off of us, even trick us into believing things that we shouldn't be believing in. So there were all these stories about Russia potentially having influenced elections in many other countries, including the US and the UK. So yes, this cyber warfare is actually going to be the next big domain. But the real big challenge that we will face as we move towards this more digital frontier is that, in fact, it's much more easy to regulate a biological or a chemical weapon, because there's a laboratory that's required, there's a certain level of expertise that's required. But how exactly are you going to regulate this teenager who might be sitting in their parents' basement and coming up with the next new big cyber weapon? It's not easy.
Sorry, Nishanth, we are running out of time, and I do want to get to the other guests as well. Nolen Gertz in Eskende, what do you think? Do we need a Charter of Human Rights, a Charter of Digital Rights?
Yeah, I think we need to stop thinking of privacy as something that we trade off with security, and instead think of privacy as something intrinsic to what it means to be human. And that is the grounds for developing not just human rights legislation, but really an education, a global education in what it really means to engage in this kind of cyber warfare.
And Amichai, Stein, what are your thoughts?
I think we need something like this, but much more privacy. But I think it's going to be very hard, because each country has, if you do a set of rules, they can operate a shadow army of 18-year-old hackers. So it is going to be, even if you do a set of books of rules about privacy, about tracking, this is going to be very hard to implement at the end. It's important to do, but it is going to be very hard to implement and take care that things like this doesn't happen, even in the state level.
I want to thank all our guests. It's been a fascinating discussion. Nolen Gertz, Amichai Stein and Nishanth Sastry. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.